Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to the Business in Crisis Survey Findings webinar by Team Consulting. Just wanted to give you, before we begin, a brief history about Team Consulting as an organization. Founded in Zimbabwe in 2004 as Team Consulting, Team is engaged in providing strategy-based business advisory services to a wide range of private, public, and non-profit organizations across sub-Saharan Africa, and evolving into team advisory services with registered offices in Zimbabwe and Zambia, and partner-based arrangements across various African countries. Our underlying values are wisdom, servanthood, and propriety. Our philosophy is derived from our name itself, team. We recognize and embrace the notion of excellence through collaboration, that together we are smarter than me. Our mission is helping organizations unlock quantum value in their operations in order to realize organizational significance. Team advisory services now operate as a group company, and our various services are delivered through our business units that provide clients with management consulting, support, and provide business insights and engage human capital and drive business operations. Coupled with this, they're supporting individual and within organizations to ensure that they bring their head, heart, and hands to their work and in the correct state and space to be able to give their best at all times. Our presenter today is Mr. Eric Sinyengere. Eric is the managing consultant and co-founder of Team Advisory Services. He has been a consultant for more than 20 years with experience in strategy formulation and implementation, managing the results and performance, including RBM, the balanced scorecard, team building, business process management, and training. He has provided consulting services across many sectors in Zimbabwe, Namibia, Botswana, Lesotho, Tanzania, and Zambia. Eric is a student of transformation and lives by his personal mission statement to help people and businesses unlock and realize their God-given potential. Eric is also working on a part-time basis as the national coach and consultant for the Ease of Doing Business and the Rapid Results Initiative of the government of Zimbabwe in partnership with the World Bank. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you, Tino. Sorry, I moved a slide there before you could get started. Well, good morning to everyone. The essence of our time together here today is to just do a quick overview of the work we did in this survey. So the things I'm going to cover during this presentation is just an introduction in terms of where we came from and an overview. Then share the survey findings, discuss a path forward, and then try and spend some time just talking about what this means and what we believe the implications are for business. I'm hoping that most of you have had a chance to download the document already, so you've had a chance to go through it and at least immerse yourselves in it. Now, feel free during the time we're here to throw any questions in the Q&A, or in the comments, and then we will deal with those when we come near to the end of the session. So feel free to do that. Any comments, questions that you have, and then we'll try and discuss those near the end of the session. I will unmute everyone as we come to the end so that we can, if we need to, also converse. But for now, I've muted everyone so that we can just go through the slides. If there's any slide where you've got a question, as I said, just put in your comments in the comment box, and then we'll address it when we come to the end. All right. So Nick Jonas says, life happens, adapt, embrace, change, and make the most of everything that comes your way. And this is the kind of philosophy that we've been using as we did the work here. Excuse me. We believe that organizations need to adapt, connect, and thrive in this environment. Now, it's usual for us consultants to come up with these wonderful acronyms and so on. So we've worded this one as ACT. Now, we are in times of great uncertainty, mainly due to the impact and implications of COVID-19 on individuals and organizations. But we also get the sense that this uncertainty goes much beyond that. And I'll talk a lot more about uncertainty and the scenarios we've put around it a little bit later on. But when we initiated this, our thought process was organizations are going through a lot of uncertainty. How can we, talk about this? How can we help them? What can we discover? What are the implications for what's happening in the environment? And that's where we started from. So we've come to a realization that you have to adapt, connect, and thrive. Adapt means you have to speak to opening up our minds to new ideas, questioning the status quo, and being willing to go against convention in times when things have changed. Connect, this is a time when we need to connect with one another, to share ideas, to find ways in which we can, cement whatever we have had before, but also to grow together. And thrive. For us to thrive is not just to succeed, but also to survive first and foremost, and to be able to identify what survival mechanisms are necessary to then move on to thrive and survive. So this survey, in terms of demographics, we looked at 64 different organizations, and I would like to thank any of those who are on this call who represent those organizations for taking time to respond to the survey. We had 75 responses, 68% of which were males. 86% were decision makers, and that's an important point for us because it does give credence to the work and the content of the survey that a lot of the people who responded are decision makers in their organizations, and so the things they're saying are not just things in their own heads, but things that probably the organization is pursuing and seeking to achieve. If you look at that respondents by level, you can see that CEOs or managing directors and then owners and founders constituted 37%, while executive management, another 36%, and senior management, 13%. That together gives us the 86% that we've noted as decision-making respondents. We did have a few people out of Zimbabwe. We had a few respondents within the SADC region. A few of those were from Namibia, South Africa, and Mozambique, funny enough. And then unknown 8% of people who didn't give us any response at all in terms of where they're from. So we don't know if they're Zimbabwe or elsewhere. We had quasi-government institutions also respond to the survey, which was a good thing. A lot of them are the regulators, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And then that was 16%, but 80% of respondents were from the private sector. In terms of sectoral analysis, just digging deeper into that, looking at the types of subsectors that individuals were coming from, financial services represented the largest with 20 responses, and this is both banking and insurance. Then we had professional services, which is a wide breadth for us because we looked at legal, we looked at consulting, we looked at security. We just cut across when we called it professional services. Then industrial products and fast-moving consumer goods. Those two are important for us to discuss at the same time because a lot of those are the manufacturing companies, but there's also a few retail in there. Then we had health. The unknowns were 6 responses, and that gives them 8%. Then it's just important to note that, some sectors, the percentage looks small, but, there are substantial entities that did respond from those sectors. So communication, for example, we had 2 of the 3 cellular networks responding. But it ends up looking very small in terms of a contribution to the level of responses. So what are the key findings and what are the things that this survey is saying to us? Well, before I get into the findings, let me quickly recap on the areas that we've covered in the survey. So first and foremost, we've looked at the impact of COVID-19, but we've also looked at what this meant for cash flow disruptions, key people issues, recovery factors in terms of how a business is expecting or organization is expecting to recover from this process or from this crisis. And then the status of plans that were in place, and then any other critical success factors that may be needed to look at and to support the organizations moving forward. So let's start with the impact of COVID-19. The greatest impact that organizations have noted is that of implementation of plans. A lot of plans have had to change. And, I would say if there's any organization that says to me today that their plan is exactly as it was and nothing has changed, it would be very hard for me to believe, because the essence of it is a lot of us have had to change the way we think, had to change our plans, put them on hold, put them on pause, maybe make adjustments to them because of the changes that have been caused by COVID-19. And I'd say for those looking at it from a Zimbabwean perspective, that's even broader, because there's been so much other uncertainty going on beyond just COVID-19. And all of those things have had an impact on whatever plans had been set by institutions. Now, the second was the ability to perform against budget. If your plans have changed, it also means that it's going to affect your budgeting, and that is expected. But I also wanted to really talk about the 61%, which is the business model. A lot of organizations noted that they're going to have to rethink their business models, change the way their business models are designed. This is both from a perspective of, what you're delivering to clients, how you're delivering it, but also even in respect of, is the business still making sense? And I think there's some hard questions that a lot of organizations are going to have to go through during this time, or because of this impact in terms of their businesses. Some businesses, and we had a chat with one organization where the CEO said to us that, during this time, they've been able to run the business with only 15% of the staff in head office. They've got all the staff on the ground who work, but only 15% of head office staff. And they're asking themselves the question, do we really need to go back to the model where all our staff are required? We spoke to another quasi-government agency where they noted that because they were not prepared to work remotely, most of their staff don't have the technology to work remotely. And so only those with access to technology have been working remotely, but they've been able to continue to provide all the services they needed to provide. Obviously, those services might have been at a reduced level, but those questions are questions organizations are going to have to ask, to say to ourselves, do we continue with the same business models, or do we have to change these business models to fit into the environment in which we see ourselves? In terms of proportions, or the proportion of respondents who feel that their cash flows have been disrupted, 92% say that their cash flows have been disrupted by this crisis. Only 8% say that they don't feel that their cash flows have been disrupted. And it's interesting because those ones primarily are sitting in sectors that are providing services right now, or we have been providing services from the word go since we said we were on lockdown. So those sectors are obviously bound to have benefited. I know that, I spoke earlier about most organizations' plans would have changed. But I also know that we spoke to one player in the health sector who actually indicated to us that, there's nothing they're going to change in their plan, because everything is working according to plan for them. Everything is perfect, which obviously, one man's meat is another man's poison. And so even in this time of crisis, some have found opportunity, or some are able to do just as well as they've always done. Gary Hamel, who's one of the great writers on business re-engineering and things like that, and business redesign, says the world is becoming more turbulent faster than most organizations are becoming more resilient. And that, is something we need to really keep in our minds, to say, are we becoming more resilient? Are we finding ways to adapt as fast as things are changing? Because if we do not adapt as fast as things are changing in our environment, then the likelihood is we will collapse. So we also thought it was important to ask organizations what would be most useful, in terms of being able to recover from this crisis. And the thing that was mentioned the most, 76% of respondents said that government support in terms of policy and funds would be critical in recovering from the crisis. What's very interesting is that 71% spoke about flexibility on statutory payments, which once again is still a government-related issue. So government has to play a significant role in helping to support and address recovery during through this crisis caused by COVID-19. Now, it's also a cause for concern. Because if at any time the policies and the things done at a government level are contrary and actually add to the pain, then the process of recovery or the ability to recover for entities is going to be even longer and even harder to achieve. Now, I raise this because one of the things that we saw happen just around this time is that NASA decided to increase their contributions. And this is at a time when organizations are suggesting that a flexibility on statutory payments is critical. And that for us suggests that that's a cause for concern, because it certainly doesn't improve the level of doing business. It actually hinders it and affects organizations at a time when they actually need support in that respect. So I think that decision was a bit short-sighted and not necessarily taking full account of what's happening around. It's no good to increase statutory payments and end up having no one pay them because companies have collapsed. Now, it was also quite interesting for us that short-term loans were not deemed to be very useful. Only 43% of respondents indicated that they would find some use in short-term loans, with an entire 21% actually saying they wouldn't even think about borrowing short-term. And I think this is because this crisis or the effects of this situation are much longer than we expect. It's bound to take us much longer to recover. And if it's going to take a long time to recover, that means that borrowing short term is not the way to move forward. You don't want to be stuck with burdens and having to struggle to pay back loans in a very short space of time, because you won't be able to meet those obligations. And that might then actually force you to move to a point of liquidation. So it's important to appreciate, and I'd say for companies who are operating in that sector of providing loans, financial services, this is important to keep in our minds, that long-term loans are probably the key to moving things forward in this respect. So we then spent some time just trying to analyze those recovery factors by sector. And there's not a lot of difference in all the sectors, but there are things that we thought were important to keep in mind. That the difference for short-term loans is that for private sector, they were still slightly higher, in terms of 50% of companies in the private sector saying we could do with short-term loans, whereas obviously government or public sector said it was even lower. Health, this aligns with the government support as the most helpful factor, but certainly they don't think revision of their plans and business models would be that important, because obviously the health sector is actually thriving during this time in some ways. Yes, they're going through challenges of their own, but at the same time, the demand for health and the future needs of health, people are beginning to appreciate the value of having health insurance, of things like that, and being healthy. So that in itself means it augurs well for the health sector. Energy, oil, and gas. Government policy is important, but they also moved and said they would have to revise their business models during this time, and that would probably be even more critical than any other. Short-term loans still remain the lowest. Quasi-government agencies also feel that flexibility, they don't really talk about flexibility on statutory obligations. And this was quite humorous for us, because obviously they're the same ones who provide those statutory obligations. Just to be clear and to mention that the quasi-government entities that did respond, I'll mention them by name so that you at least get a feel of an appreciation of what that meant and why we're saying they're the same regulators. We had NASA respond, we had Zimbabwe respond, we had the Medicines Control Authority respond. We had a few others who aren't necessarily regulators, but those three are regulators. And as such, you can understand them not necessarily seeing flexibility on statutory obligations as being all that useful, because that's their source of revenue. Financial services sector, this is a sector that is entirely dependent on people. People are what drives the financial services sector, and hence their highest area of recovery is staff re-engagement, that they need to make sure staff are re-engaged and staff are on board and doing what they need to do. The retail sector talks about flexibility on statutory obligations and revised business models as the most useful. Yes, the retail sector certainly has to start thinking about how differently do they run their businesses. Social distancing means you can't have as many people in the shop. And I don't know for how long we'll continue with that kind of an approach. And so that in itself means, your volume during the day is going to be affected, no matter how you want to look at it. People will then say, I can't just stand in one shop and go to the shop I've always gone to. Maybe I need to try another one. And all of this obviously is compounded by the fact that from an economic standpoint, the economy itself is suffering. And so even disposable incomes for individuals are also affected as we look at it. Professional services sector is very similar to the big picture, with the only switch, that being the least helpful, moves from short-term loans to staff re-engagement. Thought this was interesting, considering that professional services and financial services should both be concerned about staff re-engagement. But I guess the issue is with professional services, and the way we define it, it's an expert-based sector. And a lot of the time they have limited staff, and it's more about the actual, the owners or the founders and their expertise, or the core team. So they might not see the re-engagement of general staff as being all that critical. Insurance, although it's a subsector of financial services, this sector really spoke about the revision of plans, revision of their own plans and business models as being things that they need to focus on. Manufacturing, deemed the most helpful being government support and access to short-term loans. So the one sector that did speak about it and thought they do need access to short-term loans is manufacturing, obviously because they need to get a quick start back up, and so some funding immediately would probably be relevant and necessary. Now, when we look at managing people in crisis, the question we asked is, so what are the things you need to do to manage your people during and after the crisis? What are the most important people issues? And the point we've continued to highlight, even in the social media and what we've been talking about, is the one related to staff rationalization. Only because during the crisis we don't see a lot of organizations seeing the value and the need to rationalize their staff. Maybe because people are trying to figure things out. But the concern is that after the crisis, and for some, we might say the crisis is over. Not that it's over in the essence of, we still have COVID-19, but businesses are starting to get back into the working environment. And if businesses are starting to get back into the working environment, they're now having to start to ask the question, okay, so what are we doing now with this next normal or evolving normal, or whatever word you might want to call it? How are we going to operate? And in that instance, staff rationalization has become a big issue. 71% of institutions said to us that they would probably need to relook their staff and rationalize their staff base. This is quite worrying, and I think it's been compounded further because what we're seeing is that COVID-19 has become a catalyst to so many other things that are affecting the environment. For countries like Zimbabwe, COVID-19 itself, in terms of the levels of infection and so on, have not been as significant as we'd like to talk about, as we've seen in other countries. However, the impacts of what COVID-19 has done in terms of limiting export markets, because borders are closed, in terms of increasing inflation, in all the other things that have been caused by it, are what now will affect organizations, and is going to cause organizations to start saying they're going to have to think differently about certain things. And as I say, staff rationalization becomes a big one. The other things that organizations seem to feel will be quite important after the crisis is productivity. Staff have to be productive, and performance management, managing people better. It's interesting that retention is also there, but I think that's there because, it will be important for organizations to retain the critical skills that they have, those that can help them to move forward through the crisis and beyond. Well-being for us is something that we thought was actually quite interesting because, from before and after, well-being has been determined as something that is of vital importance. And I know that chatting to one CEO, they said to us, one of their major concerns right now is that people are now working remotely from home. And these are people who've never worked from home before. And that in itself means you need to actually make sure if they're okay and ask them that question, are you okay? And help them to deal with the changes that this brings to their lives, because it requires a lot more discipline. It requires thinking differently to be able to work from home. And so there is a need for dealing with staff well-being. There's also the danger for some that they will now not be able to strike a balance between home and work. There are people who always knew when I leave the office, I'm now going home, and I balance my things that way. But now home is the office. And being able to then create that balance is not as easy as maybe it sounds when you just say it. So as we look at those same factors to do with managing people in crisis, just looking at some specific sector trends, productivity and performance management, they were mentioned by everyone pretty much the same, and well-being as well. But retention, we see this strongly in the financial services sector and the health sectors, who feel that it will be critical to retain staff. And of course, these are expert areas where you do need certain levels and certain specialized skills. And that might in itself be the reason why they say that. Every area has expertise, but the specialized skills, sometimes the demand for certain ones make it critical for retention of those staff. Rationalization, manufacturing said it would be quite important. So did consultancy, our industry. 60% of consultants don't see rationalization as key after the crisis, mainly obviously because, as I said earlier, consultants don't have large staff bases anyway. But the financial services sector and quasi-government all said rationalization in health and energy and oil will be a relevant factor after COVID-19. And I can understand that. As we think about energy, oil, and gas, the ability of our fuel companies to be able to bring in fuel, the ability of our fuel companies to be able to then service the demands that are coming through. All of those things are quite difficult at the moment because of the lack of foreign currency in the country in itself. So over and above the fact that we have the whole crisis, we then have a lack of foreign currency, and so there's so many other factors that then make that worse than it would be if it was just one crisis. We spent some time asking the question, so when you look at your different plans that you've put in place, what's the status of these plans? Are they still relevant? Will they need to change? What will it mean? And if you look at the annual, you can see how small the apple is, the piece of the pie is that says that these plans are still relevant. The bulk of it is saying that the plans are no longer relevant. If you then look at medium-term plans, you can see that there's a slightly bigger level of organizations that think that their medium-term plans will be important to keep in mind. And obviously at the 5-year plan level, there's more who say that their plans will still be relevant. We thought this was mainly because, broadly and long-term, some plans are valid, but in the short term, they're going to have to change the means by which they implement those plans. And that in itself is what those organizations need to keep in mind. But for us, what was most important is the point that we've put at the bottom here, that 95% of respondents feel that their annual plans will need some level of modification due to the crisis. That means a lot of organizations need to seriously rethink their planning. One of the things that we've heard being spoken about over and over again is the 30, 60, 90. 30 days of a plan, 60-day plan, 90-day plan, and that organizations are going to have to start doing a lot more of that, planning a lot more frequently for shorter periods of time during this crisis, and even after it, for quite a period of time until there is some stability and clarity as to how things will move forward. So that does require that organizations seriously rethink their planning. But I also think it's critical that organizations begin to appreciate and find ways to track and measure what it is they're doing in those plans, and to be able to have regular updates on what's going on with their plans. Just as we look further at the planning status and the status of different plans, it seems some numbers have disappeared here, but we know that 79% of plans said that of the annual plan said that they would need to relook a broad framework and address a broad framework. Only 5% felt that their annual plans are still applicable. Whereas when we look at the medium-term plans, which is the one in the middle here, 3% of respondents actually said they do not have medium-term plans. So for them, the fact that they don't have the plans means they're not even worried about that at the moment. And 13% here didn't have medium-term plans, whereas everyone had an annual plan. It was quite good to see that everyone did have an annual plan. 61% of the medium-term plans would need some modification. The broad framework might make sense, but they would need some modification and tweaking in terms of the actual implementation of it. And that's a lower figure when we look at the long-term plans at 43% of them requiring some tweaking of some sort. Now, we asked, what are the critical success factors during the crisis? And I must apologize here because I have no idea why the slides are not showing clearly. The slides had percentages and criteria all around them. So just to allow us to be able to actually see that, I've put it in this mode for now, where you can see here that adequate production as a critical success factor during the crisis was only at 4%, and the most critical success factor, the most critical of all the factors during the crisis, was client satisfaction and retention, and at 51% of organizations. And this is quite important because obviously organizations need to make sure they retain their clients during a time such as this. And this in itself means organizations need to spend some time in understanding their customer insights, what's going on with their clients, and getting a better pulse of those kind of issues. Innovation and business redesign was the second most important during the crisis, followed by leadership. And we made a mention there that everything rises and falls on leadership, which is a quote from John Maxwell. And it is quite pertinent for us to appreciate that, how we lead in times of crisis has a big bearing on whether or not organizations are able to navigate these issues. So leadership is a key issue. And one of the things we've learned is that sometimes we neglect the development of our leaders or the development of our people during times of crisis because we're so focused on the crisis going on around us. But at that time, it is vitally important to be investing in and ensuring that you're developing the people that you need to continue to navigate through and after the crisis. Because if those people are not being developed and not being equipped to address the issues they're going through, then you're bound to go through challenges as an organization. We noted that other issues of importance were planning and security of supply in terms of raw materials. Now, after the crisis, things are slightly different because there's a switch between client satisfaction and retention and innovation and business design. The innovation and business design takes on a much higher level. And that just speaks to the fact that organizations are going to need to be a lot more innovative, thinking differently as they look at the evolving normal. It's critical that organizations find ways to innovate, to find new ways to do what they do. And this is where business redesign becomes quite important as well, sitting down and having those conversations. One of the things I would say personally is quite important at this time is to allow people in the organization to share ideas. Because what you will find is that a lot of the innovations you need are already in the organization. People know the kind of things that they need to do things differently. But it's also important that you continue to be listening to the customer, because customers, should become a major driver of strategy as we move forward in of business design. If we're designing business models without taking account of the customers that we're going to serve, then we're going to have problems. The days of just, as the quote says, people always look for and eat bread, but with the evolving normal may think twice about the need for certain services. The days of just assuming that people need every service is not there anymore. And, I laugh because when we put this quote down, we spoke about bread. But just yesterday, I was having a conversation with my wife, and she says, bread is going to become hard to buy for some people at $50 a loaf. And that's quite true. So even there has to be some rethinking of business models to say, okay, if we know that we had bread as a thing that we know was an attractive thing for every person to walk into the store, can we still continue to buy the levels of bread we've been buying in the store? Can the bread makers make as much bread as they used to make? All those things are important. And when you think about bread, it's a perishable product. It can't last forever. So we are really having to rethink and come up with new innovations to adjust to the evolving normal. Adequate production, though not mentioned by everyone, and at 7%, was quite key for those in the fast-moving consumer goods manufacturing as a critical success factor after the crisis, because obviously they need to and are hoping to be able to get back to levels where they can still supply the market. Now, if we were to take a look at and compare, the two before and after, during and after, you can see that the biggest jump is in organizational performance. This is seen as there's a 20% jump in how critical it is that organizations manage and ensure that they have good organizational performance. And for me, that then speaks to the need to have clear and useful tracking mechanisms to measure the right things and to measure them often, so that those things are able organizations can quickly course correct in those areas of most critical importance. And it's important to continue to have an interrogation about what is most important to us moving forward. What are the things that we must measure? And I would say, you want to identify 3 to 5 key things that as an organization you're measuring during this time. It's not necessarily as many as you may have measured in the past, but just those 3 to 5 that you are constantly measuring on almost a daily basis. Operating pretty much the way, for many years, the bread industry has operated, where they have a discussion about profits of bread every day. That's the kind of level of conversations we need to be having with certain key indicators. But as a business, you need to identify what those are and measure those on a regular basis, looking at the environment that we are in. Now, if we go further and just take a look at additional issues experienced as a result of COVID-19, we asked organizations, what other additional issues have you experienced as a result of COVID-19? Obviously, cash flows, which we spoke about earlier, were mentioned again. And this is mainly due to delayed payments by so many clients who don't have the funds to be able to pay maybe as quickly as they usually would. Then operating constraints. And, when it comes to operating constraints, we looked at things that are affecting the enabling environment for organizations to be able to do what they're doing, whatever those operating constraints could be. Then compromised contracts. There have been delays in people being able to fulfill and meet the obligations of contracts that they had signed. Access to business requirements. This is really more in terms of things like supplies. When the borders are closed, yes, we might be saying goods are coming through the border, but it's not as efficient as it needs to be, and things like that. So those supplies are affected. Then managing COVID-19 related costs is quite a big one. Organizations are incurring additional costs because of the COVID-19 situation. Some of those costs don't make sense to the organizations. Organizations are having to fund paying for tests, paying for masks, paying for cleaning up their offices, fumigation, and things like that. All of those things mean additional costs that were not necessarily planned for before. So as you look at all those things, we tried to group them and said the broad areas: financial is the big one in terms of issues affecting organizations as a result of the crisis. And then the second being the operating environment, then people, then legal matters, and finally the operations themselves. So these are the things that are affecting organizations. Just to mention that one of the things mentioned was the ability to work from home as an area of concern. And that's something that, organizations certainly need to be able to say, how do we make sure people are able to work from home? There are costs associated with that too. You might need to now actually fund, computers and things like that you probably weren't necessarily funding anymore. Then, in terms of other expected long-term impacts due to COVID-19, 85% of organizations is the number that we saw who feel that they'll have to make some fundamental change to the way they do business, from changing their business model, work culture, structures, or becoming more digital. So all of those things are things that are expected as long-term impacts of COVID-19. That 29% at reduced profitability means there's going to have to be a lot of thinking and lean thinking, restructuring, cost reductions and things like that in organizations to be able to adjust. Digitalization, a lot of organizations didn't think they'd have to become digital. They didn't have to think they'd have to adopt new technologies. But we've come to a point where that has become real. And now we have to be able to take on new technologies and say, how do we utilize different technologies to be able to meet the changing needs of the environment that we're going to be operating in? So that kind of summarizes the survey. When we finished looking at the survey, we asked ourselves some questions. What does this mean in terms of business? And we had seen other business scenarios shared by other thought leaders. Clem Santa, who's a great thought leader on business scenarios and does business scenarios for South Africa, shared the tightrope scenario, which we've included here as one of our scenarios, in terms of where South Africa is actually sitting. He felt strongly that South Africa was on a tightrope. And, we thought to ourselves, now we can't actually look at this and talk about COVID-19 alone, because there's a level of uncertainty which is a much greater variable affecting organizations and affecting businesses in this time. And the second is obviously the state of each organization's or country's economy. Now, from an uncertainty perspective, we said this takes into account issues of political development, social conditions, access to markets, goods, health considerations, including the spread of COVID-19. So COVID-19 has become one of many elements that that we believe relate to the level of uncertainty affecting the scenarios that organizations would probably find themselves during this time, and the other being the economic state. So we've come up with 4 scenarios. The tightrope, as I've already mentioned, which is a scenario where there's a high level of uncertainty and the economic state is quite low or negative, which means those organizations are on a tightrope. Any wrong move and it's all gone. You've got to really manage and navigate very carefully. Now, those with low uncertainty but negative economic state, we've called that a treadmill scenario because those organizations are just going over and over the same things over and over and over and over again, but getting nowhere, going nowhere quickly. Is kind of the thought process there. Then we've got the roller coaster scenario. And this maybe to some might be seen as the W that they continue to talk about when they talk about COVID-19 specifically. They talk about COVID-19 specifically. If you look at the roller coaster scenario, the roller coaster scenario is a scenario where you're going up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, and that's likely to be the case where there's a high level of uncertainty, but there's also a positive economic state. It does mean there is some flexibility and some allowance to go back and forth. Now, the bullet train is where the uncertainty is low and the economic state is positive. It's just going. But the issue with that is you also have to be careful to make sure that you ride the train where you can, because at some point the train must stop. And so those are the kind of scenarios that we then ended up brainstorming and thinking about. And we've given a lot of thought to these scenarios. We're actually hoping to be able to share a paper with some ideas on how to deal with these scenarios in the next couple of weeks to all of you, so that you're able to actually take that and utilize it and how best you can. Now, we did look at the sectors that we had included in this survey and where they sit in terms of, on the model. And we kind of feel that most entities are sitting in that tightrope scenario, but we felt insurance wasn't exactly in the tightrope scenario, only because, there's certain types of insurance that are being seen quite important now. People are thinking a lot more about life insurance. People are thinking a lot more about health insurance, because all of these things are things, and funeral insurance or funeral cover, because they're realizing that life can be quite short. That's one of the things that this crisis has brought about, and that reality has meant the insurance sector has actually ended up being in a slightly more positive place. But the short-term side of insurance, you do find that there's a lot of rethinking there, and people asking the question, do I really pay cover for all these things anymore? So that side of it might be affected a bit more. When you look at health, broadly, health is sitting in that same area of roller coaster, but we felt that private practice is not, mainly because private practices were not open throughout the crisis, and a lot of private practices are having to start rethinking. And we had a number of dental practices respond during the survey, and we thought that this is, for them, they're quite affected negatively, because the uncertainty still remains quite significant for them. Financial services, banking is sitting in there as well. Essential services, though, for manufacturing, we felt actually is sitting in the bullet train, because those services are required. I mean, if you're manufacturing something that's required right now for the health sector, if you're already producing, gloves or face masks, and you're able to keep doing that, then obviously there is some opportunity there. But even those opportunities don't last forever, and organizations have to keep that in mind. From a national perspective, we just threw in a few countries that we kind of thought would be useful to look at. Zimbabwe is sitting right there in the corner, with high uncertainty and negative economic state. And that high uncertainty is that high because of there's so many other things going on beyond just, COVID-19. In the US, we actually had to move it up after the whole, the issues that have risen around racial divides and so on, because now things have shifted from COVID-19 to talking about issues of race. But that just means they've compounded the levels of uncertainty in that country, and that has a bearing on where they sit. China, because they've begun to recover and seem to have a plan to move forward, we've actually put them straddling the bullet train and the roller coaster. They might still go back up to roller coaster, but we're kind of sitting there for now. So this is kind of our thought process in terms of where the different entities are sitting and countries on the model that we've put for scenarios. And we'll be happy to engage more on this. If you feel your industry is placed in the wrong place, let's have a conversation. And even other sectors that are not sitting in here right now, we're happy to talk about them too and start thinking about where they should be sitting in the model. So moving forward, the key takeaways for us from all of this is that the COVID-19 crisis is far-reaching and most organizations are affected in some shape or form. And it's going to have a bearing on the bottom line looking into the future. Organizations will have to make some fundamental changes to the way they do business, from changing their models, work cultures, structures, and to becoming more digital. People are going to remain a critical asset for organizations, especially those with critical skills that are needed in times such as these, which will require a more robust angle in terms of staff development and wellness programs. And then being able to understand, collate, and compare key trends and insights across the organizational sectors will be critical in customer retention. Understanding data and managing data better is going to be very important as we look forward into the future, because information is truly power. So because of that, we've ended up saying to ourselves, there are 5 crisis vehicles, 5 things that we feel would help organizations to move through the crisis and even beyond the crisis. And here I'm not talking about the crisis, it's just COVID-19, but whatever crises we're facing in our different countries due to the levels of uncertainty going on. These vehicles would be critical to help with that. Wellness, supporting staff well-being through targeted interventions to reduce anxiety and promote easier adoption and transitions to new evolving norms. Business analytics, which is what I've been speaking about, collecting and analyzing of organizational and market information to provide better insights for better decision-making. Planning and implementation, we believe, is at the center of all of this. Interpreting and operating scenarios and development of appropriate plans. You know, we're in a place where organizations can't plan for one scenario. They must plan for every scenario and mustn't actually say this is the best case, but actually be thinking, how do we deal with whichever scenario and plan for all of those, which means a lot more planning and thinking than before, but a lot of it has to be rapid, and you have to be talking about rapid implementation and progress tracking. Then business transformation, adoption of innovative tools and to design new business models, re-engineer processes, realign structures to the evolving normal. So all of those things are things that organizations need to be thinking about. And finally, engagement, which is just to align their cultures with the new business approaches and to ensure that staff are engaged to those new cultures, to whatever values. You know, one of the things we feel is organizations in crisis must lead with values. If you don't lead with your values, those must be what everyone comes back to and says, this is our anchor. We have values that we live by. Because it's very easy for people to start doing things differently and probably doing things the wrong way during times such as these, when it's hard to keep track of everything that's going on. In terms of addressing the business scenarios, the different business scenarios will require a different cocktail of solutions. So this is a slide we put in, which is not in the report that you downloaded, but this is one of our slides from what we're preparing in terms of the scenario reports. And all we've done here is we've thrown around different ideas for each of the different quadrants, and we will share this slide with all of you on the call after this so that you can take a little bit more time to look at it. But I just want to highlight a few things. I've already spoken about leading with values as being critical for those sitting in the tightrope scenario where we are sitting as a country and where a number of the businesses are sitting. Conducting more pulse research, which is, you know, quick research, not asking 50 different questions, but 3 or 4 questions on a regular basis and seeing how those questions are being answered and evolving so that you're able to maintain and keep a pulse of what's going on around you. Managing costs, refreshing business models. So this is really not renewing or coming up with a new model, but looking and saying, how do we, refresh our existing business model? Because at the moment, completely redesigning a business model might not make sense because you don't fully yet have certainty to be able to do that. So, it's one of those things that is difficult to agree, but it also depends on the business and what's happening. Focusing on stability and strengths. What are your strengths? Those are the ones that you need to focus on to be able to remain stable in such a time as this. Short-term planning and implementation and review. All those things are things that are important. Managing change and ensuring that people understand and appreciate that. Staff redeployment and reduce time. People might have to work less time. People might have to be redeployed to different areas. Sometimes redeployment even means being redeployed out of the organization. And that doesn't sound nice, but that's the reality of that. When you look at the other side of it, where you've got organizations that are in the roller coaster, staff burnout is highly possible because people are working a lot longer, trying to balance. They're having to go to peak, down, peak up, peak up. It's quite difficult for them to be able to maintain that, and you have to address those kind of issues a lot more. So if you see here, the things we've shaded in yellow are things we're kind of saying probably you'd need to talk about from a wellness perspective. The things we've put in red are to do with innovation. In purple are to do with innovation and business design. The things we've put in white are to do with planning. Then those in blue are those to do with engagement in terms of the leader and the organization itself as a whole. And we believe that you have to lead from a different place as you look at the different perspectives and the different scenarios that you might be facing as an organization. And one of the things we've decided to do, and these are the tentative dates as they stand right now, but we're still to finalize some of these dates because we're hoping to be able to bring in other panelists to actually share ideas on some of these areas, is we've decided that, during this time, we also need to help all of you and help all of you add value to your organizations. So we'd like to try and hold some webinars, which are very practical and specific to some of these areas, to give you some ideas and tools and things you can do immediately to help you address some of these challenges around the 5 crisis vehicles that we've identified. So we'll be taking some time to do that. And, we will share a link to be able to ask you to just register your interest in attending these. We don't have, as I say, although we've put dates there, we have not yet finalized those dates because we'd like certain people to participate in those, certain partners of ours who are experts in some of these areas so that we're able to speak to and really add value to yourselves in the conversation around what you can do to address some of these crisis vehicles. You can actually also just register for these in terms of linking on our website. If you go to our website under upcoming events, we've got a register button there, and it will allow you to just express your interest in eventually being notified when these sessions are going on. And it allows you to choose which ones you'd like us to tell you more about as we prepare for, or as we then engage and discuss these further. So let me conclude by saying organizations need insights in order to be able to adapt during the crisis, create the right connections and appropriate approaches to thrive into the future. That's our strong belief, that we need to act, adapt, connect, and thrive. And we'd like to do that. We believe we need to do that together. We need to have those connections to be able to support each other and say what can be done as we move forward. I'm going to open it up now and actually to unmute everyone, but I've had a few questions raised here. So maybe we'll answer these questions first, which have been sent through, just questions. Let me read the first one out, and then I'll try and respond to it, and then we'll move forward from there. So the first question asked was, with respect to the revision of business models, in South Africa, we've seen some organizations in retail, restaurants and fast foods expanding to digital channels to improve reach to clients in their homes. Would that work in Zimbabwe? What issues should organizations look to make that move to make that move a success, or to make that move focus on to improve their speed of response and visibility to clients? The quick response to this question is that already we have seen some businesses beginning to create online channels. We actually have a pizza business that I heard about recently that started during this time, and it's an entirely online pizza business. They are delivering online. And so, yes, the opportunities are there, but I think what it does require is it requires us having appropriate tools and resources to be able to do that. I also watched a video yesterday about a community in Wedza where ladies are using motorbikes that they're renting on a monthly basis to be able to do their deliveries for themselves. Even nurses are using them to be able to go and collect sick people and bring them back to the hospital so that they get treatment faster. All of these are innovations that are possible. So digital channels, yes, but I think there's also other channels that can be adopted, especially in more rural areas in respect to a place like Zimbabwe. Our challenge with digital channels continues to be connectivity. But if kids are able to learn online right now, I don't see why certain orders can't be done online. And of course, I'm sure dialer delivery You'd know dialer delivery has been around for a very long time, even from before this, and they continue to be a channel to deliver fast foods. Maybe the retail sector needs to do a little bit more there. I know that personally, I've dealt with one of the retail outlets where what they do is they allow me to make an order online, and then I just go and collect. I don't have to stand in the queues for social distancing and all that. I just find the order ready and prepared there. So those are innovations, once again, that can be done. Then we've had another question here, which says, frequent short-term planning could, in terms of frequent short-term planning, could organizational productivity, could scenario-based planning be helpful in the new, more uncertain context? Yes, I think all of that is definitely critical in the new, more uncertain context. In this evolving normal, as we keep calling it, organizations do need to start thinking differently, and trying to do certain things from a different perspective. So what we're going to do now is we're going to allow everyone to feel free to unmute yourselves. And I've unmuted everyone just to allow you to make any thoughts, contributions, comments that you'd like to make around, or ask any other questions if you have them before we actually wrap this up.
Yes.
All right, great. Doesn't look like anyone has any other questions. Look, feel free to reach out to us. You've got our email addresses, or even on our website if you do have any other questions or any thoughts that you'd like to add on what we've shared in this presentation today. Otherwise, thank you all. Oh, okay, I see another question here. Sorry. In terms of wellness, was there any mention of mental health? Yes, there was. And mental health is a big issue. We're actually right now working on a partnership that's going to allow us to be able to equip organizations to actually provide mental health themselves to their staff. It's an area that people are greatly affected. And unfortunately, my colleague wasn't able to make this call today, who works with us in that specific area. But we're hoping that when we do the session on wellness, he'll be there to speak a lot more about that. And we're also hoping that the guys we've been chatting to who've been providing mental wellness in rural communities will be able to share with us their thoughts on how that can be done in the work area, because that's an area where we need to do that, into the corporate sector as well. All right, great. Well, thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure chatting to you, and we hope that this process and this presentation has added value to your work and your areas. We will share the slides. The slides were available on our website. There is a download link to them. If you just on our front page, if you click on the link to this seminar or the business to this talk, you'll find that the slides are also there for you to be able to access, take a look at, and access. I will actually just respond to everyone with our website address so that you can go on there and pick up the slides if you haven't already done so. But as I say, we will add on the slide, and we'll upload the slide on the scenarios that was not in the presentation, and that will be made available as soon as this session is done. I've put the link to our website there, teamadvisoryservices.com. Starting a new business, that's an interesting question. What was your take in the survey in starting a new business? I see a few more questions are coming through. Starting a new business in this environment is not a bad idea if you've got the right business. I think that's the essence of it, because as I said to you, the guys who are doing online pizza delivery started their business during this crisis, and they're doing very well. So it's about you identifying the right business model, the right business opportunity to be able to run that even in this time of crisis. You know, it is in times of crisis that some great businesses have been set up and established. So that opportunity does exist. Okay. I think we're done. Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure, and we will see if we can even also share a recording of this presentation for you to be able to rewatch if you need to. we'll see if that can be uploaded and the size of that file. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Let's keep pushing and let's keep striving. Thank you.